Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Visualizing War and Peace podcast. My name is Otilia Meden, and I'm one of the student researchers at the Visualizing Peace project here in St. Andrews. Today's conversation is the first episode in the series that I'm doing on the connections between love, care, and peace in our society. To kick off this series, I've invited Dr. Roxani Krystalli, who's a lecturer within the Department of International Relations at St. Andrews. Roxani's latest research on how to take love and care seriously offers great insights on how to use feminist approaches to peace and conflict studies. Moreover, Roxani has worked as a practitioner in humanitarian action, transitional justice, and peace building for over a decade. Roxani's work has greatly inspired me to turn my attention to the loving and caring practices within peace building. So, on that note, I'm very pleased to have you on today's conversation, and thank you so much for taking your time to explore these connections between love, care, and peace in greater depth with me and the listeners today, Roxani.
It's a joy. Thank you for having me.
So I'm just going to delve right into it and ask you the first question. So why is love and care important in peace building and in politics?
Yes, thank you. It's a question I've spent a lot of time thinking about myself. And I think starting with why is love and care important to a human outside the university is the best way to approach this. Love and care animate a life. They enable life to go on. They add texture, depth, joy to that life. And so if we start from that premise, I can't imagine a study of politics, a study of peace that did not engage with the forces that enable life. And of course, then, if we proceed to examine the fact that a lot of the study of peace and conflict, particularly within universities, is about violence, we will recognize that even though love and care are part of how people repair the world and reimagine the world in the wake of violence, they fill less of the frame in the academic study. And that is what my very lovely colleague, Dr. Philip Schultz at the University of Bremen and I are attempting to address through our project to take love and care seriously in the wake of loss.
Yeah, and that's so fascinating. I wonder if you could delve a little bit deeper into how love and care right now is being addressed in both your experiences with peace building.
Yes, I think I can start with my own oversights. I have thought about love, I have experienced love, I have practiced love, and indeed the same with care for a very long time. But all of my peace building work focused on suffering, and that is indeed an appropriate focus because one of the aims of peace building and humanitarian work and transitional justice and related fields is to document, alleviate, prevent, and respond to suffering. So we're absolutely not advocating a focus on love and care instead of suffering or as a method of denying suffering. We're really interested in an approach that takes the coexistence of love and suffering, of care and harm seriously. And so when I look at my own work, I think there are lots of reasons that I did not pay adequate attention to love and care. There was perhaps a sense that love and care were not as urgent as some of the problems that I was called to respond to as a humanitarian practitioner documenting gender-based violence. That was absolutely a misguided sense. Anyone who has ever cared for or been cared for someone else, anyone who's ever been in love will know that there's tremendous urgency to these questions. But somehow suffering seemed to have a mobilizing effect that love and care did not in my previous work. And that is something that I've sought to correct with Philip recently. Another reason is that very often the academic study of violence has not sufficiently engaged with love and care. I am a feminist scholar, and so I think a lot about the politics of seriousness. I think a lot about how some questions, some methods, some approaches are feminized and treated less seriously than others. And so there's perhaps a sense in some corners of academia, certainly not in all, and that's important to clarify, that love and care are not as academic or as political as the other forces of world politics. Again, Philip and my research shows just the opposite, but we're also interested in the power dynamics that render the questions of love and care to appear less academic or more private or more intimate or less serious or less political than whatever people imagine the questions of world politics to be. I guess the last thing to say about this is that for the people who have experienced loss of all kinds, be it the violence of armed conflict and its related harms, be it grief, be it perhaps the losses that many are experiencing in the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, love and care are not peripheral or trivial. They are central to survival. So we're not attempting to correct an academic problem. We are attempting to reflect the centrality of love and care to people's survival.
It's such fascinating insights. And from engaging with some of both your work and your work with Philip Schultz, it really turns attention to this huge gap that I have often felt within academia, and especially within international relations, as you've just outlined so perfectly. Another interest of mine in my research has been this connection between love and care as more communal practice, as well as love and care as self-care. I wonder what this connection might mean to you, and what do you think the connection between both love and care for oneself, but also love and care for the community is?
Yes, that's a great question. Before I answer it, if it's okay, I'd love to comment on what you just said about the gap as well. A lot of people, especially within academia, talk about the gap in literature, the gap in knowledge that we hope our research fills. And I have to say, I am skeptical about the framing of the gap. And that's for two reasons, and they both have to do with love and care, which is why I was hoping to discuss them. One is there are always people generating knowledge in corners of the world that some of us might not know about. It could be that for international relations scholars, there are anthropologists or sociologists or philosophers who generate that knowledge in a different field. And so Philip and my work has really benefited from engagement with work on the ethics of care, a lot of which happens in political theory or philosophy or feminist theory, from the anthropology of love and care, and from looking really interdisciplinarily. And so for me, rather than starting from a premise of lack, of saying nobody has looked at XYZ, I'm interested in who has already done this work. Where are they situated? What is it that they know? And what can the rest of us know from engaging with it? And that's also a premise of abundance for me, a premise of acknowledging that knowledge is collaborative and co-created. And so we're not inventing love and care or innovating or coining it. Indeed, everyone experiences and practices love and care in different ways and to different extents. We're just thinking about what the synergies are of thinking about it in a certain way. And the second reason I try to be careful about the framing of the gap is because it can fetishize individual action. It can make the individual researcher appear very grand. There's a bit of a Columbus effect, right? Of so-and-so has discovered this or coined that. But if you think about it, it's actually a loving and caring practice to say everything we think about, everything we create, everything we do and practice, we do together. And we do it on the shoulders of others. And so I'm very interested in starting not from a mentality of shortage, of saying, oh, international relations has completely ignored this, even though both international relations and other disciplines have significant limitations in what they take seriously. I'm interested in starting from the premise of where does this knowledge exist? Where do these practices exist? And how do we build on them? And this links to your question on self-care. If you look around you, self-care is everywhere right now. If you look on Instagram, if you look on, Mother's Day posters, which were everywhere in the UK right around the time that we are recording this podcast, everyone is being prompted to take care of themselves. I teach a class at the University of St. Andrews on the politics of nature and place. And on one of the weeks, I ask students to keep care diaries where they document all kinds of care that they practice and all kinds of care that they receive. And indeed, the class is on the politics of nature and place. So we're interested not only in human care, but also care for the more than human or other than human. How do your environments care for you? How does sunshine nourish and sustain you? How does the fact that St. Andrews is located by the sea fit into that equation? How does the sea hold you, help you cope, help you dream? And so we're interested in tracking those relations of care across vectors, human and more than human. And my students are also very good at noticing when self-care gets co-opted to become a less caring project, when it becomes really individualized, when they are encouraged to buy a 60-pound candle and call that self-care. Absolutely nothing against candles. I love candles myself. The point that I'm trying to make is that self-care to me is not an individual practice. It is not necessarily a capitalist practice of purchase, of consumption, of becoming a customer. But it is linked to broader power dynamics and community dynamics. I think it's worth pointing to Audre Lorde here, who thought about self-care as communal care. So when we're talking about the self, Lorde did not think that the self is just an individual unit divorced from the world trying to survive one candle at a time. But for Audre Lorde, who at the time was dealing with a cancer diagnosis as a Black woman in the United States, self-care had to do with systems of healthcare and whom they let down and disappoint. And alternative systems of care that in that case, Black women in Lorde's life set up to account for the failures of official systems of healthcare and help people survive, cope, and maybe even flourish and thrive in certain situations. So I'm hoping to work with these tools and with these inspirations with my students, with Audre Lorde, with the sea, with the sunshine, towards an understanding of self-care that goes beyond the self, that goes beyond consumption, that takes power into account, and that also hopefully goes beyond survival to encompass flourishing and thriving.
It feels like there is an immense call right now for that too. And as you just said, perhaps it has always been there, and it's a question of turning our attention to those practices. And I wonder, in terms of how it connects to peace, and also how it connects to peace building processes as sometimes often imagined only happening in the big realms of UN and not so much on boots on the ground. In terms of your work, have you experienced this connection of self-care and the communal care as a more unified action? Have you experienced that within your work or within your academic studies?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I suppose I should start with the moments that self-care or narratives of care are also co-opted within formal peace-building processes or humanitarian action. I have spent a lot of time over the past 13 years working as a practitioner. A lot of that time has been in Colombia. A lot of it has been in other places. And I have primarily worked with people who identify as victims and survivors of armed conflict, but also with ex-combatants, refugees, people on the move, to understand how gender has affected their experience of violence, but also their experience of survival and seeking justice. And indeed, that work as a practitioner intersects with my academic work, and I see the two as informing one another. And so as part of that work, I have often observed workshops that one international organization or another, and I'm not naming anyone here because the phenomenon I'm describing is so pervasive. So it's not about exposing any particular actor, it's about reflecting on the broader dynamic. So I've observed numerous workshops at which one actor or another will invite usually women who have been affected by armed conflict to come to a self-care session or a mindfulness session. And the workshop will involve something like asking those women to take deep breaths or to talk about how they're feeling. And usually the prevailing mood in those rooms is irritation. And the reason that those women are irritated is not because they don't believe in breathing. It is because the structural and material conditions of their lives are such that they do not enable breathing. And what they hope international organizations and NGOs and this conglomerate of actors that I too am part of will do is not run a mindfulness workshop, but actually ease the barriers to breathing in their life. So if you're hungry, if you're worried about caring for your children, If you have been a victim of war for 10 years and you still have not been able to access reparations or humanitarian assistance, you don't need a mindfulness workshop. You need someone to address those particular barriers. And so I think being aware of the dissonances of care in that situation is really important. And I think we shouldn't export this problem to war zones for people who work in universities like me at the moment. There's also a tendency to offer a webinar on mindfulness, but not necessarily think about what are the conditions that staff and students work and learn under. And what do those have to do with people's well-being, as opposed to having puppies at the library or offering a particular webinar? And so I'm interested in the moments in which international organizations try to formalize care, self-care, well-being, and why that message sometimes falls flat. And then on the flip side of that, there's, of course, the contrast of how do people practice care in their own day-to-day lives. And they don't need to be taught that. They already know that because that is the care that enabled them to survive. A few years ago, I worked on a project with the NGO Mercy Corps to understand how people affected by tremendous violence in Syria and Iraqi Kurdistan were able to survive and what a relational lens could show about those strategies for survival. There were a series of reports. The one that informed these comments was called Wages of War, led by a wonderful researcher called Kimberly Howe. And so one of the things that we found doing that research was that sometimes what humanitarians considered to be good coping strategies actually undermined people's own strategies for care and survival. So a good example of that is that people were very, very upset when the humanitarian aid packages started having less tea in them. And the reason there was less tea in the packages was because there was a concern on the part of nutritionists and people who think a lot about the food dimensions, food security and insecurity, malnutrition, all related ailments in armed conflict. They had a concern that people were drinking a lot of tea, which they often took with sugar, and that led to adverse health outcomes, which of course became much harder to address in the middle of violent conflict. I want to be clear, that is a legitimate concern. But what people were saying is at that moment, I don't care about my diet. Tea is what allows me to come together with people. It's what allows me to check on my neighbor. It's what allows people to speak and to tell stories that they might not otherwise tell. It's also what allows me to practice care, sharing tea that came as part of people's food packages and food distribution. And that is a case where people's own caring rituals, caring practices, senses of who they were in the world and who they were to each other, and how to weave and preserve community during war, were potentially undermined by very well-intended change to humanitarian practice. And so that's an example of how people care for one another without necessarily labeling it care, without saying, I'm going to go practice self-care or care towards someone else, but having an instinctive sense for what those rituals and practices are and how they enable survival during war and in its wake.
Yeah, that's so fascinating hearing about your experiences, because I think often we tend to forget this contextuality within it and how different that depends on like what self-care means, why, how, and for whom in different contexts. So jumping off from there, how do you think then conversations about love as well as these acts of care can be utilized in the realms of peace building and politics? And you have already addressed it a bit, but taking that as well as self-care being a universal thing or a thing we do in community with one another, it's also calling for an individual understanding and a contextual understanding, as you just highlighted. And I wondered then, moving on into the realm of politics and peace building, how do we make these conversations more accessible? Who do we invite in? How do we go about and do that? Because as a student who's a second year in international relations, it often feels like this is not on the agenda.
Yes, that's a really, really astute observation, Otilia. And I suppose what intrigues me about love and care is that they invite us, whether we are students or teachers or politicians or people in war zones in any capacity, to really rethink about who is a political actor and what politics is and where politics takes place. So again, I am a feminist scholar and a feminist practitioner. And what that means to me is that I don't think that politics is out there. I don't think that politics is just electoral politics that happens in parliaments by elected officials, although, of course, I am interested and take my feminist curiosity and sensibility to those politics. I'm interested in everyday meanings of the political. I'm interested in how victims and survivors of war define the political, experience the political, do politics in their day-to-day life. That's politics with a small p, not a capital P. And so what love and care do is they reorient attention to that kind of political. And in the process, they produce and they reclaim it. So I'm very interested in that. More practically, when I ask my students to keep care diaries, what we do together is we also analyze them. So obviously documenting is a first step to a whole lot of change, whether we're talking about documenting violations in the context of armed conflict or just documenting care. Indeed, feminists over time have talked about how time diaries are a way of showing inequalities in the household or the workplace. So time diaries are a strategy of writing down where all your time went in a day. And then you figure out that actually women did a large percentage of the housework, both at home and in their respective institutions. And so looking at the distributions and the story they tell. So we did something similar with care diaries in my class. I encourage students to think about what is missing here. What is perhaps the care that you failed to document or pay attention to? Were you more likely to notice the care that you gave or the care that you received? Were you more likely to notice the care towards humans? Because it's difficult to conceptualize more than human or other than human care. Did documenting care potentially make you more caring or shift the practices of care that you engaged in? How do you feel about the gendering of the care that you gave and the care you practiced and the care that you received? And so indeed, those are political questions. And so really reimagining the political through tracking, practicing, enacting, receiving care is one of the opportunities that we have here. And I should also say that talking about love and care is not always pleasant. It is not always delightful. Care can drain the caregivers, and love can be profoundly frustrating. And so I'm not interested in a conception of love and care that makes them look always appealing or always easy. Love and care are hard work. And they can be rewarding work. They can be the work of survival, the work of politics, as we were just talking about. But I think acknowledging that caring labor is labor in the classroom, at the university, in war zones, in healthcare settings, and that it has effects on the people who do it that are not always fully appreciated or recognized is an important aspect of the equation.
Yeah, that's also speaking into the fact that peace building is not easy work. It's also about building or working for it. And I think that's such an important aspect of it too, that it's not a utopian solution, both peace building as well as love and care. And I mean, coming off from there, do you think then that there are certain aspects of love and care that must be, highlighted more when it comes to conversations about it? Or where does one start to even bring that conversation into the room if there's so many dimensions, so many layers to it? And I wonder if you could finish off perhaps by mentioning where does one start by bringing this conversation and taking it seriously?
When Philip and I first started working together on this question of taking love and care seriously in the wake of violence, A lot of our colleagues within academia said, that's really interesting. Tell me how you're conceptualizing love and care. Or what do you mean by love and care? And our instinct was actually to resist that question, not because we were avoiding it, and not because there aren't really good concepts for love and care in the world. Indeed, we're particularly inspired by Bell Hooks, who talks about love as a practice, not just as a feeling. Feelings matter, of course, but we're interested in that relational practice, the doing of love and care. So the reason we resisted defining love and care, despite the fact that there are all these fruitful influences and ways to conceptualize it, is because some of the important work of the politics of love and care is understanding how other people define it, experience it, practice it, miss it, yearn for it. So where we start to respond to your question is asking people to talk to us about love and care. In Philip and my case, in conflict-affected settings, it often means starting by saying, tell me about love and care in your life, or tell me about the role of care in survival, or how do you think care fits into the work of your organization? And people are often confused by that question because it breaks from a lot of paradigms of how interveners, be they academics or practitioners, show up in people's lives. But that's a welcome confusion and a welcome break for us. And similarly, in the classroom, thinking about what are the moments that care shows up? What is a pedagogy of care? What does it mean to teach with care or to learn in a caring environment? What are the possibilities for mutualities or reciprocities of care? There's a wonderful PhD student I work with at the University of St. Andrews called Q Manivanan, and a lot of their work is about care, grief, and protest in India and beyond. And what they're interested in is not the one-way transaction, the one-way giving or provision of care. They're interested in those mutualities and the ways in which care disrupts hierarchies. And so I think the place to start is to ask about love, to ask about care, to let the answer be open, to let a story emerge in meandering ways that are not constrained by predefined concepts. That means we also need to be able to listen for love and care, to notice the erasure of love and care, including from our own narratives about world politics, as Philip and I found by looking at our past academic work, and to wonder about those erasures as well.
It's surely giving a lot to think about and also a lot to carry in mind moving forward, both speaking again from within the university as a second-year student, as well as many other of my fellow friends that I have conversations with. They have equally been confused by this question of, I said I would do a podcast on love and care and peace. And of course, they can see how those concepts connect, but they're also quickly dismissing it as only happening up here and not in our everyday lives. And I think that's an important aspect of it for me to move forward with and for everyone else, and keep on asking those questions and acknowledging that they're difficult.
Absolutely. And keep wondering about why some things are quick to be dismissed, whereas others are taken seriously very quickly, and keep insisting on resisting the dismissal.
So I think from here, I'll say a huge thank you for you taking the time to talk with me today. And I'm very excited to both follow your further research on this, as well as keep on asking those questions about love, care, and peace in our society, and hopefully help stretching our understanding of what peace means.
Thank you so much for having me. And Philip and I are both really excited to continue with the next piece of that work.
Thank you. And thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us again as we continue to explore how peace is understood, depicted, imagined, and visualized in our society. I will persist asking these important questions over the next 2 episodes by inviting people into the conversation, sharing their different perspective about what love, care, and peace mean in relation to one another. If you would like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualizing Peace or get in touch directly by emailing us at vispeace@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young, and the show was mixed by Sophia Gerten.